10-year-old Scott Eastwood was crying in the backyard of Johnny Carson's Malibu home. When he asked, "Doesn't my dad love me anymore?" Carson knelt down and touched the child's shoulders. While paparazzi camped outside, an intergenerational friendship was born inside. This was the most secretly kept story of night, and the words Carson spoke that day would completely change Scott's life. To understand this event, we must go back to the autumn of 1984, to one of Hollywood's darkest periods. Clint Eastwood was at the peak of his career, but his personal life was a complete nightmare. His 14-year marriage to Maggie Johnson had turned into a blood feud in the courtroom. Alimony, custody rights, property division. Every day a new scandal made headlines. But what was truly heartbreaking was how his 10-year-old son Scott was affected by this situation. Both were quiet, introspective men who had grown tired of television's artificial glitter. Carson had never brought Eastwood on The Tonight Show, which was a sign of the respect between them. Clint wasn't fake, Carson would say years later. There were 3 people in Hollywood who weren't fake. He was one of them. Carson's house in Malibu looked exactly like a hidden cove among the giant rocks by the ocean. High walls surrounding the house and lush palm trees made it impossible to see from outside. The private beach opening from the backyard was a secret refuge known only to Carson's guests. The constant roar of ocean winds prevented conversations inside from leaking outside. Johnny's close colleague Ed McMahon remembered those days. Johnny had been very distracted lately. He was constantly making phone calls, looking worried. "Some friends have hard times," he told me one day. "That's when true friendship emerges." In the last week of October, media pressure had become unbearable. Morning newspapers were filled with the Eastwood family divorce case. "Eastwood demands $20 million alimony" was the headline on the Los Angeles Times front page. Carson was reading the newspaper while drinking his coffee when the phone rang. "Johnny, this has gotten very bad." Eastwood's voice was tired and desperate. "Scott can't go to school. Reporters are constantly waiting at the door. We spent last night at Maggie's mother's house, but that place isn't safe anymore either. Clint, you and Scott come here. You're safe here. Johnny, no. This could get you in trouble too." That evening, returning home from NBC studios, he was quieter than usual. He had told his driver Pete, "Go home early tonight. We might have guests." On that last October evening of 1984, darkness had fallen early. When Carson's Malibu home's door rang at 9:30 p.m., there were 2 silhouettes outside, one with sunglasses and a hood, the other a tiny child holding a small suitcase. Clint Eastwood and his son Scott had reached this secret refuge, fleeing from the media storm. "Uncle Johnny." Scott smiled for the first time that day when he saw Carson. Carson hugged the child. "Hello, cowboy, welcome." While touring the house, Carson had made special arrangements for Scott. He had placed a television, game console, and many books in the guest room. "Until you can go back to school, you'll have a private tutor here. You'll meet her tomorrow." Clint felt guilty. "Johnny, I don't know how long this situation will last. My lawyers talk, we live," Carson said calmly. "You and Scott can stay as long as you want." The first nights were an adjustment period for everyone. While Scott easily adapted to the new environment, Clint withdrew more into himself. Carson played with the child during the day, while trying to cope with Clint's silence in the evening. On their first weekend, Carson found Clint on his terrace. As the sun set, they both silently watched the ocean. Carson brought 2 glasses of whiskey. "Johnny, for letting me stay in your home." Clint was about to begin. "Shut up," Carson said with a smile. "Friends don't talk like that." As they drank their whiskey, Carson asked, "But what about you, Clint? I've known you all these years, but have you ever really told me who you are?" Clint laughed. "The real Clint Eastwood. Very boring, Johnny. Just a quiet farmer's son. And now you're the world's most famous cowboy." "Cowboy role," Clint said. "But in real life, I seem unable to master the role of fatherhood." Carson took a sip of his whiskey. "I couldn't master it either. When Rick was little, I was always on sets. Now there are walls of ice between us. But you're very good with Scott now. Maybe there are second chances," Carson said hopefully. When the first week of November ended, the media hunt outside had become even more vicious. Newspapers were running "Where is Eastwood hiding?" headlines, while a completely different reality was being lived inside Carson's house. While Scott played in the garden with Carson during the day, Clint watched television silently in the living room, barely speaking. "Dad used to play ball with me," Scott complained to Carson one afternoon. "Now he always looks sad." Carson asked while making cookies with Scott in the kitchen. "What about you? Are you sad too?" "Not me. But why are people so curious about us?" "I haven't done anything bad." Just then Scott dropped the bag of flour in his hands. The entire kitchen was covered in white dust. Carson and Scott looked at each other, then burst into laughter. "Uncle Johnny, I think I'm going to be a terrible cook," Scott said sadly. "Don't worry, cowboy," Carson said, shaking flour from his hair. "I botched my first Tonight Show too. But look now." "Really? And cleaning this flour will be your first homework." While they cleaned the kitchen together, Scott asked, "Uncle Johnny, why did you never get married?" Carson paused. "Actually, I did get married, Scott. 3 times. But I couldn't make any of them work, because I loved my work more than my women. That was a big mistake." Scott looked at him thoughtfully. Is Dad making the same mistake? That question pierced Carson's heart. Carson felt his heart tighten at that moment. This child just wanted a normal childhood. When they talked with Clint at night, the situation was even clearer. "Johnny, I can't talk to Scott anymore. Whatever I say comes out wrong. It's like he thinks I've disappointed him." "Clint, the child understands you. He just wants his father to be with him, not to be perfect." As the days progressed, Carson found himself increasingly in 2 different roles. He would wake Scott up in the mornings and have breakfast together. The child listened spellbound to Carson's old Hollywood stories. "Uncle Johnny, do you really know Frank Sinatra?" he would ask, his eyes sparkling. "Of course I know him." In fact, once, while Carson entertained Scott with his stories, he noticed Clint also listening intently. Maybe these stories weren't just for the child. One evening, all 3 of them were sitting in the living room watching television together. An old Tonight Show episode of Carson's was being broadcast. Scott asked in amazement, "Uncle Johnny, is that you?" "Yes, cowboy, that's me from a few years ago. You're so funny. Does Dad ever make me laugh that much?" Clint laughed. "No, Scott, I'm not as funny as Johnny. But you're a cowboy. Do cowboys have to be funny?" Carson intervened. "You know, Scott, real cowboys aren't always funny. But sometimes being strong is more important than being funny." Clint gave Carson a grateful look. Carson was unknowingly strengthening Clint's paternal image. 2 weeks had passed, and the situation was beginning to get complicated. As Clint's depression deepened, Scott was becoming increasingly attached to Carson. "Johnny, I'm a terrible father," Clint said one night. "When Rick was little, I was on sets. Now I'm making the same mistake with Scott." Carson listened patiently. He could see that Clint was struggling with his own past guilt. "Johnny," Clint said one night as they drank whiskey on the terrace, "the 3 weeks I've spent in this house have been the most comfortable times of my life. Why? Because here I don't have to be Clint Eastwood. I can just be Clint, and Scott can just be a 10-year-old boy." Carson thoughtfully turned his glass. "You know, Clint, sometimes I get tired of being Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show too. Always smiling, always being funny, always being perfect. Sometimes I just want to be Johnny." They both silently watched the ocean. Then Clint asked, "So who is the real Johnny?" Carson laughed. "I guess the person I see in Scott's eyes. Someone trying to be a father, doing his best, but sometimes failing. Johnny, you're a great father to Scott, but I wasn't to Rick." Clint turned to Carson. "Maybe it's not too late, Johnny. Maybe Rick would like to see the love you give Scott too." This was while Scott, doing his homework in Carson's study, was listening to the conversations as much as he could hear. Hearing his father talk about himself as a terrible father had broken the little child's heart to pieces. In mid-November, Carson couldn't find Scott in the morning. He searched everywhere in the house. The child was behind the big palm tree in the backyard, looking at the sea and crying. His little shoulders were shaking and he didn't even notice Carson approaching. "Scott, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" The child turned to Carson, his eyes swollen. His cheeks were wet with tears. "Uncle Johnny, Dad said last night that he disappointed you. I disappoint him too. That's why he doesn't want to talk to me." Carson didn't know what to do at that moment. The child had misunderstood his father's words, but the pain he was experiencing was real. He could feel his heart beating faster. "Scott, come sit here," Carson said, pointing to the stone bench under the palm tree. This conversation was just preparation for what would happen in the next hour, because although Clint Eastwood hadn't noticed his son crying, he thought it was time to free himself from being a burden to Carson, and the decision he would make in the afternoon would create a major break in the 3-way friendship lived in this secret refuge. In the shadow of the palm tree, when Carson sat next to Scott, he felt the child's trembling stop. As the wind from the sea ruffled their hair, Carson put his hands on his knees and turned to Scott. "Scott, you never disappointed your father. Do you know that?" Scott's voice cracked. "Fathers sometimes talk as if they're talking to themselves." He was talking about himself, not you. Carson's voice was soft but determined. "Sometimes adults can be scared like children too." Scott turned his eyes to Carson. "Does my dad get scared?" "Of course he gets scared. He's scared of losing you. He's scared of being a bad father. He's scared that you won't love him. Carson lowered his voice. Scott, fathers aren't perfect. Sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they get sad. Sometimes things they don't know happen. His son Rick's cold looks came before his eyes. Yes, I make them too. Very big mistakes. Clint was now close enough to hear them but still wasn't visible. He stood in the shadow of the terrace, leaning his hands on the railings, listening silently. Doesn't my dad really love me? Scott's question froze the air. Carson turned to the child. His eyes filled. Scott, fathers can sometimes be clumsy at showing their love, but you are the most precious thing in his heart. Do you love me? This question caught Carson completely unprepared. He felt a knot in his throat. Yes, Scott. I love you very much. I love you too, Uncle Johnny. At least you talk to me. At that moment Clint Eastwood came out of the terrace. He walked slowly towards them, his steps making no sound on the grass. Scott stiffened when he saw his father. Dad. As Clint approached the palm tree, Carson stood up, but Scott remained where he was. There was fear in the child's eyes. He tried to hide behind Carson. Scott, Clint said, trying to control his voice. Can we talk? Carson stood between them. He could see the pain in Clint's eyes, the fear in Scott's eyes. Three men stood there silently, the ocean wind rustling the palm leaves. Clint couldn't find his words. Dad, am I a bad boy? Scott's question hung in the air. Clint's face changed. He knelt down, coming to Scott's eye level. No, sweetheart, you're the best boy, the best son. Then why won't you talk to me? Clint's voice began to tremble. Because I'm scared, Scott. I'm afraid of saying something wrong and making you sad. Carson stepped back at that moment, making room for the father and son. Scott slowly came out from behind Carson. I won't be sad, Dad. I get sad because you're sad. Clint extended his arms. Scott ran into his father's arms. When Clint hugged his son tightly, tears flowed from his eyes. I'm sorry, Scott. I'm very sorry. Carson felt his own eyes fill as he watched them. But the scene he saw awakened completely different memories in him. Because Carson also had a son and the distance between them was never this close. While father and son hugged, Carson silently walked towards the house. When he went inside, he leaned his hand against the wall, noticing his breathing quicken. The memory of that last fight with Rick years ago came before his eyes. You were never home, his son had shouted. You never had time for me. What had Carson said to Rick that day? I earn money, you live comfortably. That's enough. He only now realized how wrong he had been. These 3 weeks he spent with Scott had mercilessly shown him what he had missed with his own son. Rick was now in his 30s, and there were walls of ice between them. Because Carson couldn't learn to be close to him, Rick couldn't learn to be close to his father either. That's why he had become so attached to Scott. In this child he saw the father-son relationship he couldn't have with his own son. Scott seemed to be giving him a second chance. That evening when Carson picked up the phone, his hand was shaking. Dialing Rick's number had become increasingly difficult over the years. The phone rang 3 times. Hello? Rick, this is your father. The silence from the other end squeezed Carson's heart. Dad? Did something happen? No, I just wanted to talk to you. Rick promised to come and visit Carson the following week. When Carson hung up the phone, he felt peaceful for the first time in years. Clint and Scott's situation was also improving day by day. The media storm had slowly begun to calm down, and Clint's lawyers had been able to make more reasonable agreements. By the end of November, the ice between father and son had completely melted. Johnny, I don't know how to thank you, Clint said one evening. You didn't just shelter us in your home, you reminded me how to be a father. Carson laughed. I learned something from you too, Clint. It's not too late. Scott also didn't want to leave Carson, but now he missed spending time with his father more. Uncle Johnny, you'll always be my second father, won't you? Carson hugged the child. Always, Scott. Always. In early December, Clint and Scott left Carson's home, but the bond between them never broke. When Scott went to university, Carson wrote him regular letters. The friendship between Clint and Carson also grew stronger. Years passed. Carson had also fixed his relationship with his own son Rick. Rick had started visiting his father regularly, and the ice between them had completely melted. When 1989 came, it was a special night for The Tonight Show. Carson had prepared a program that night with the theme Friendship Night, hosting old friends. When Clint Eastwood came on stage, the applause seemed endless. Clint, you're coming to The Tonight Show for the first time. Is there a special reason for this? Carson asked with his usual humorous manner. When Clint sat behind the table, there was a different expression on his face. He was serious but also emotional. Johnny, actually there is, but first I want to tell you something. Oh, this is starting dangerously, Carson said. The audience laughed. Johnny, you never brought me on The Tonight Show. Why? Carson was surprised. Because you weren't fake, Clint. The Tonight Show was too fake a place sometimes. That's why I love you, Johnny. You always tell the truth. The audience silently watched this intimate moment. So why are you here now? Carson asked. Because I think America needs to know about the kindness you did for me in 1984. Carson's surprise on his face was genuine. Clint, what are you talking about? Johnny, that year I was getting divorced. The media was tearing me and my 10-year-old son Scott apart. You hid us in your house for 3 months. A deep silence fell over the studio. But you didn't just give us shelter, Johnny. You taught me how to be a father. You became a second father to Scott. Carson's eyes filled. Clint, No, Johnny. Listen. At that time I couldn't talk to Scott. I felt like a terrible father. You told me this, Clint. Money brings but love takes away. Give Scott your time, not your money. Carson remembered that moment. Yes, I said that. This word changed my life, Johnny. You melted the ice between Scott and me. The audience listened silently. And there's something else you don't know. Clint said with a smile. During that time, you also called your own son Rick. While saving us, you also saved your own family. Carson was surprised. How do you know this? Because Rick told me. I saw him last month. He talked about that phone call of yours. Carson wiped his eyes. Really? Johnny, you're not just a comedian. You're a lifesaver. And the world should know this. At that moment, there was a small movement from backstage. The stage manager whispered something in Carson's ear. Johnny, Clint said, I actually have one more little surprise for tonight. As Scott Eastwood emerged from behind the side curtains of the stage, he was 15 years old at the time, had become a tall, handsome young man. Amid the applause in the studio, he ran straight to Carson. Uncle Johnny. Carson jumped up and hugged Scott. Both of their eyes filled. The audience had risen and was applauding. Scott took the microphone. Johnny, first I want to confess something to you. The time I spent with you those 3 months was more than the time I spent with my dad. Clint's eyes filled. But you taught me something very important. How much my father loved me. You never said your father doesn't love you. You always said your father loves you very much but doesn't know how to show it. Carson's voice cracked. Scott, you've grown so much. Growing up, I always remembered your words. You said, Scott, real manhood isn't being strong, it means protecting. Now I'm a father too and I'm teaching this word to my son. Clint stood up, hugged Scott. All three stood in the middle of the stage. Johnny, Scott said, you weren't just my second father. You taught my father how to be a real father too. I didn't do anything, children. That's why you're great, Johnny. Clint said, you don't even notice your greatest kindnesses. That night, the program experienced one of the most emotional moments in television history. The audience applauded, standing for minutes. Carson, Clint and Scott embraced in the middle of the stage. After the program ended, backstage, Carson asked Clint, why did you tell this now? Because, Johnny, people needed to see your real face. You didn't just make them laugh, you touched lives. Scott added, Uncle Johnny, what you taught me during those 3 months is still with me. Every morning when I wake up I think, how can I do good to someone today? I learned this from you. Do you remember that conversation under the palm tree? You said fathers aren't perfect. That word saved me. Carson smiled. I'll never forget that day. When you hugged Scott, I knew I was going to call my own son too. That phone call changed his life. Carson's eyes filled again. Sometimes the biggest gifts come with the smallest gesture. That night, the number of letters Carson received broke records. People were sharing their own friendship stories, appreciating Carson's kindness. But the most valuable letter came from a 5-year-old child. Mr. Carson, after my father saw you on television, he plays with me more. Thank you. But the most valuable feedback came from Carson's own son, Rick. When Rick came to visit his father the following week, he said, Dad, I watched you on television last night. You don't know how proud I am. Carson's eyes filled. Really, son? You're not just a great comedian, Dad. You're a great person. It was time for me to see this. From that day on, the relationship between Carson and Rick completely changed. Father and son started meeting regularly. When Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, Clint sent him a special video. Johnny, you didn't just show me friendship, you taught me how to live. Scott and I are forever grateful to you. Now I'm a father too, and I'm teaching my children what you taught me. Carson cried while watching that video, but these were tears of happiness. When Carson died in 2005, Clint and Scott Eastwood sat in the front row at his funeral. Scott said that day, Johnny Carson's greatest achievement wasn't The Tonight Show. His greatest achievement was touching hearts. Today, when Scott Eastwood is a famous actor, he talks about Johnny Carson in every interview. "I have two real heroes," he says. "Clint Eastwood and Johnny Carson. One taught me to be strong, the other taught me to show love." And that palm tree from Carson's house is still standing. When the new owners learned the story, they put a small plaque at the bottom of the tree. "Here friendship touched hearts." That garden, which fills with children's voices every summer, echoes under the witness tree that has seen the purest form of love. Johnny Carson's words still ring in ears. True friendship emerges when it touches crisis. And that friendship continues to be remembered for generations, because some stories are unforgettable, especially those written with love. If this story touched you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell us in the comments, who in your life opened their door like Johnny Carson did? Carson's kindness changed a child's life forever. Sometimes the greatest heroism is helping quietly. Let us know what city you're watching from. Remember, true friendship emerges when it touches crisis. You too can be someone's Johnny to their